this show that we've loaded ended up being pretty close to where we wanted to be. And at this point, we'll do some exposure corrections to kind of open it up a touch here. Maybe take a little bit of the warmth out to neutralize the image a touch. And pretty light touch, not a huge difference, just a little bit of exposure there.
I usually work with exposure first and normalize the exposure, meaning I sort of take out any cast, or I kind of put the overall contrast and exposure where I think it needs to be. And then once I get that established and in the place I really like, I can sort of massage highlights and shadows going into a video grade tool set, and I'll adjust those as I need to.
And then we wanted to kind of do a mild kind of split tone feel. So in a separate layer in video grade, I'll switch over and maybe we'll push a little bit of warmth into the highlights. Now, since we're working in log, lift gamma gain is one of those correctors that kind of contaminates other parts of the image. So for example, by say taking red out of the shadows, which is the other thing we're doing, it's also pulling red out of kind of everything else. So you have to sort of counter that by adding red into the highlights, for example. What we wanted to do here was take a little bit of red out of the shadows and push a little bit of warmth, which is say red yellow, into the highlights. So kind of doing that simultaneously to kind of clean up the image but keep that warm key on her cheek there. Now if we went too far, you can kind of create a very sort of stylized split tone thing, and that's not really where we were going. And so really we're just taking a little bit of red out of the blacks and then putting that warmth into the highlights by going in the opposite direction, essentially the opposite direction. And that kind of is where we ended up on this setup, for example.
As a colorist, I think what makes a great image is this sort of intuitive balance of tone and color and texture. I think colors that sit in appropriately, colors that kind of just feel integrated into the sort of texture of the scene. I think oftentimes grades to me that call attention to themselves or stand out can often be distracting. Like I find myself, if I feel the grade, even in my own work or observing others, probably more so in my own work, if I feel the grade, sometimes that's an indication of needing to back off. If it sits in and it feels as it's serving the story or serving the moment, I think that's the indication of a good grade.
I think a lot of us colorists believe that in a particular scene, like the black should be black and the white should be white, and that's some sort of rule, and that for some programming that might be, and for some applications that might be. I've never found that to be a rule by any means, because if it is, I'm certainly not following it.
Classic color theory is important. I think much like a musician, scales are important to them. It's really important to understand that stuff, and I think there's some fundamental knowledge that is critical. Having come from the early days of photochemical and digital hybrid, I got a lot of that. But I do feel like at a certain point you have to kind of let go of the scales and play music. You have to kind of let go of some of that color theory and just kind of create. It's one of those things that almost doesn't rise to the conscious level, but if you're in a difficult situation or if you're in a pinch, you can always rely upon your sort of fundamental background to kind of help you.
So from the camera source, just a bit of overall exposure and a touch of balance, and then just kind of pushing highlights and shadows a little bit subtly, and that kind of put us where we wanted to be, So the look is kind of baked into the show LUT, which is at the very end. So all this is happening before that show LUT, right? And then we just paste that on subsequent shots, check matching good, That's our previous shot that we've been working on. That's the next occurrence of that close-up. Same camera, probably same take. Match is good. Happy with that. When matching, I'm always using the same shot to match to. So if I matched on her first close-up, I get the second close-up of her to match the first one. I don't use the second one as my reference for the third one. I still use the first one to match my third one. Does that make sense? Because sometimes you can find yourself drifting if you use a different reference every time. Sounds logical, but we can go the reverse. And I usually like to start with the same grade because if they're only shooting one camera, all the work on set was to make sure that the lighting is consistent and contrast ratios are consistent. So let's at least start with that by using the same grade.
My approach to grading generally is that a lot of the work has been done on set. You know, a lot of care has been taken to match lighting and exposure for coverage. So which is why kind of my philosophy generally is to start with is come up with an exposure, contrast, and look for, say, a two-shot, and then just apply that grade just flat out to the close-up and see how it works. And if there is adjustments that need to be made, typically those are a result of the lens coloration difference or something else. And so those kinds of changes can be done in the first layer, which would be like exposure.
Probably looks like maybe it's a little bit bright. So we'll go back to exposure, again, our layer 1, and maybe just take a little bit of exposure down until we feel like we've got a match. A little bit of a color difference, again, in exposure. Before that, layer 2 highlight shadow correction. This is all just overall exposure until we feel like we got a match there. And then that's it. This show is all about sort of very clean imagery, very straightforward. The cinematography was beautiful, so there wasn't a whole lot for us to do other than these kinds of subtle corrections of lens coloration, exposure differences from various takes and whatnot. But the sort of goal was to be as clean and sort of transparent in the grade as possible.
I think the role of a colorist is something that maybe a lot of people aren't aware of, perhaps. I think it's a very important process, obviously, just like sound finishing is picture finishing, or maybe you would call it sweetening. I would actually prefer almost the phrase finishing as opposed to colorist at this point, because your responsibilities are pretty broad ranging now. But, you know, all the best efforts of everything that goes in front of the lens, you know, lighting, set deck, wardrobe, makeup, and all the careful considerations of the director of photography, and all of the best laid plans, there's always going to be a need to deal with continuity and sometimes just nature, sun, losing light, these kinds of things. And so camera matching, lens matching, time of day changes because of editorial decisions. I think all of those things come into play in the color suite in terms of refining from the original intention on set to the finish.